Hi, it's Gary Norton here. I wanted to take a couple minutes and create a follow-up video to the token video I just barely recorded. This video is going to be about the context window and specifically what it means when we're talking about tokens and the context window, as well as some things you might need to consider when you're interacting with LLMs. If you remember or haven't seen the last video, tokens can either be whole words, parts of words, spaces, punctuation, things like that. Generally, when you submit text, it's about a 75% conversion rate for tokens. So if you submit 75 words, you can probably plan on about like 100 tokens being used. Now, when you're dealing with an LLM, the context window represents the entire amount of an interaction that the LLM can remember that it had with you. Think of it as like going into a high school lecture or a college lecture, and the teacher has a clean whiteboard. They begin the lecture and they start filling things out, giving you instructions and taking notes and answering on that. But when the board's full, they generally go back and erase the beginning of the board. So whatever you talked about at the beginning of the lecture is no longer relevant. They've erased it and they start writing there. That's how the context window works. It fills up with the tokens that you enter by the questions you ask or the responses you give. It also contains all of the responses that the computer gives to you, as well as the reasoning that's used to generate those answers. Some of the recent GPT models, like the ChatGPT o1 preview, have a special reasoning mode that's kind of like when you take a test and you use like extra papers on the side to write down your work, but you didn't always include it with your test. Well, that's what the reasoning model does, and it uses up part of the context window as well. The reason why that's important is because each LLM has a certain amount of context tokens that they allocate. For the current level of GPT models, they've bumped that up to 128,000 tokens for the context window. Now, that may sound like a lot, but it needs to exist for the entire duration of your conversation. If you're asking a very simple question, then you really don't need a lot of information. Early models, and in fact, going back to the ChatGPT 4 model, they only had 8,000 tokens. So you can get by with less. But anytime you want to analyze data or have a deeper conversation, you really need these larger windows. Now, as I mentioned, they've got a context window here of 128,000. Google Gemini has actually changed things quite a bit. Their version of Gemini Flash allows for a context window of 1 million, and their version for Gemini Pro actually allows a context window of 2 million tokens. Now, this is huge. But kind of like when you remember the whiteboard example, it's one thing to say instead of one whiteboard to have 50 whiteboards that your teacher wrote notes on. You still kind of have to sort through that data and make heads or tails of it during the time you're interacting with the system. So it is helpful to have a bigger context window, but just because you have the space doesn't always mean that it's like best to use it. The general rule is go as small as possible, but as large as necessary. Now, you can have a context window of 2 million tokens and only be using 8 to 10,000, and that's great. Generally, though, the larger the context window is, the more you fill it up, the accuracy of the LLM goes down, and it can go down by up to like 20 to 25% in some cases. So the shorter and more concise you can keep your answers, the better response you're generally going to get. However, that token window is a big deal and you need to consider it. It takes into account not only the memory that you've allocated on the machine that's running the LLM, but fundamentally how they built the LLM from the ground up. A lot of the AI that's being pushed down on devices that actually resides like on your cell phone, those are really small models that are fine-tuned to really small token windows. One, so they can run on the machine, and two, so they can react quickly. The larger modules that have the large context windows take a lot longer to respond to the answers. Now, one thing I want you to see, particularly when it comes to these models on the context window and the tokens, is that you have the general size of the context window, in this case, 128,000 tokens, but you do have a maximum number of output tokens per submission. So if I were to ask a question to an LLM, like, what is the meaning of life? It would have a certain number of characters that it could respond to me in. Now, in the case of GPT-4o, I would have a window that holds 128,000 tokens. However, for the answer that it generated to that first question, it would be limited to 16,000 tokens. Now, you may say, again, 16,000 is a lot of tokens, but this by implementation is the default. When you use customization or APIs, many developers will set this really low. Typically, they'll set like max output tokens down around 2,000 or 8,000. This is what happens when you ask GPT to give you an answer, and it might go through and generate like half of your answer or report, and you need to type continue or go on. The reason is because you've hit that cap of the output tokens, and you're still probably well within your window of what the maximum output is for the context window. But again, it can only generate so many tokens at a time. Now, what you need to understand, back on my example, if I were to ask what is the meaning of life and say that it used all 16,000 of these tokens, those output tokens, because it needs to remember our prior conversation, everything it gave us as output is now considered part of the input. So if I were to ask a follow-up question like, what do you mean by, and it gave me another 16,000 tokens, if I ask a third question, the context window is already up to 32,000 tokens. It gave me the answer of the first 16,000 tokens from the first answer, the next 16,000 from the second token, plus the information that I generated. It's also allocated any reasoning to those tokens if I were using a model like GPT-1 Preview. So what will happen is when you feed in large documents or information and you keep telling GPT, give me the entire output or regenerate the entire output, you're actually burning through your context window pretty quickly. That's why sometimes it might appear that GPT gets stupid if you're asking for answers and it gives the entire context window, and it like maybe you're asking for a proposal and it gives you 10 pages of the proposal, and the second time it gives you 10 pages of the proposal, and then you tell it that you want to change a few more things, and now all of a sudden it's only giving you like a paragraph or two in its response. The reason is it's kind of preemptively trying not to lose the beginning of that context window. It realizes that the whiteboard is getting full. And so the answers start getting shorter and more terse so that it can keep everything in the context window. Now, if you tell it once again, no, don't give me the areas you change, give me the whole report. I need the whole output. Well, you may risk, again, back on that context window, that it starts forgetting what happened at the beginning of the context. Again, all of this is important because it not only is relevant to what the chat can remember in this chain, but it is relevant because when you're being billed on these, let me find the pricing. Let me go over the Gemini pricing. You're billed on the context of both input and output token. Now, in this case here, what model am I looking at? This is the Gemini Pro model. You'll notice that for every million tokens of input I give it, I'm only paying $1.25. Everything that it has to generate for me, though, is considerably more expensive. Now, I'll get into things like content caching later, but for now, for an introductory course, you don't really need to remember it. Just know that if you allow the AI to remember parts of your concept or your context window, it gets cheaper. The reason why this doesn't seem like a big deal right now is these are text-based tokens. Now, if you want to start getting into vision-based tokens or audio-based tokens, they actually start getting more expensive. I don't have one of those models up here. Let's see if these DALL-E models had it. I went rather quickly. I'm not going to bore you with waiting for it, but basically the vision models and the audio models do get more expensive. So as you implement these LLM technologies, you need to keep that in consideration as you're trying to monitor and manage the type of billing that you're doing, because many of the automated tools that you use actually interact with these things at an API level rather than using just the regular chat interface that you might be using with ChatGPT. Now, when we get into the next section, I'm going to talk about this context window, and I'm also going to talk about another context concept called RAG, or Retrieval Augmented Generation, and how that can help keep your context window smaller and actually help produce better results. So to summarize, remember, we're filling that context window up, and the more detailed you get with the questions you're asking, it gets really full really fast. Or if you use it and keep resetting the chain every time, maybe you're down into a context window of like 8,000 tokens and it really isn't affecting you. So just be aware that if you see something weird, like it's asking you to regenerate something, part of your output, or all of a sudden it doesn't remember an answer that it gave you 10 minutes ago in the same chain, this is why. Anyway, I hope that helps. I'll talk with you again soon. Bye.